Hello, welcome to, this is now the eighth week, right? But the topic today is Japanese art after 1300, I believe it is. And this, I think you'll find a lot of you will find very relevant because some of the types of imagery that were created in Japan hundreds of years ago are still influencing not just Japanese art, but world art. Let me let in this other student here. Yeah, we should. I have had a couple of unexpected delays, and that's why if you didn't see the Zoom ID number in your inbox until about 2:56 or 2:57, that's why. My daughter's sick. That threw me off. She's not coming up here to the campus. I had to meet with a new reader because one of my older readers flaked out. There's no other word for it. And at this point, I am running about 5 to 8 minutes behind schedule, but we will end on time. We won't have a problem doing that. And I'll stick around for a few minutes again, as always, with any questions that you may have. So hopefully a few people who tried before 2:56 or when I sent that Zoom meeting info didn't give up. I hope they'll try again. I should have said that if I didn't already, that's always the case. There can be a technical glitch or some other problem. I could even make a mistake in the numbering. I think I did that once, not in your class, but the other Zoom class I teach. And so I had to resend the invitation. So if you don't see the login numbers by 2:50, try again right about 3 o'clock. Okay, if that ever happens again. Okay. All right, looks like we are getting a few more people joining us. So a couple of quick things and we'll get straight to the topic for today of Japanese art. First, I'll just let you know that I want to go ahead and do the speaker view. Yeah, okay, there we go. And I think I said this when we were meeting Monday afternoon at my house in Berkeley was where I was, of course, broadcasting. Is that the word? Whatever, posting, live streaming the class. And if you missed it, you definitely want to watch that video. That'll be posted as always on Friday by, well, I'm going to say 8 p.m. because I do it by 7 and then I have to have family time. So it takes, sometimes up to an hour for lectures to post on YouTube. I have 3 of them back to back to do that with on Friday. So you can, after 8 p.m. Friday, catch anything you missed this week. The only other quick announcement is that, do we have someone here? Yeah, here we go. Admit, yeah. Welcome. Yeah, we're just starting. We didn't get to the first slide yet. Not that this is very important by any means, and certainly for most of you, absolutely no impact in any way, except that life does throw you curveballs. I'll put it in a more positive frame. I was going to say something more scatological. I told you guys I had a book contract ready to, and I did. It went totally up the flue of time. The publisher, a corporate entity, of course, aren't they all? Overnight, they decided to not publish any books that didn't have a certain guaranteed enrollment from classes. I already told them what my student enrollment was, weeks before we started negotiation. And it's down, it's down nationwide at community colleges especially, but certainly in California, and particularly at the JC level. They knew that. So somebody at top level corporate decided, and I'm not the only person, they just pulled the rug out from, I was supposed to get a contract, which I would be looking at by Thursday and sign probably Friday to start working on this book about women architects on the West Coast. Just overnight, it disappeared. I got an email from the author's rep saying, I'm sorry to inform you that we had a high level meeting and we were told not to continue with certain projects, including yours. After 15 months, I've dealt with that company. So my feeling is that company, if I can avoid them, I'll go ahead and tell you, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's the one that publishes the book you guys use. So that book, there's no problem with. It's in print, of course, and that's Sarah Gill's The Critic Sees. But it's Kendall Hunt, and apparently they don't believe in keeping their word. So, sorry, end of soap opera or soapbox statement. It's just disappointing, So I'm starting all over. I'm querying other publishers. If it ever happens, I'll wait till I actually have a signed contract, and then I'll let whoever's in my classes know if it's relevant to them. And it would be for this class, because the next time I teach with, I hope, that book available as an ebook, it would have been an ebook, it would be part of the syllabus. I've already gotten that authorized by the art department and the academic senate. That's appropriate. And it would be way less expensive than most textbooks that you guys are required to buy. But still, it's not happening for the time being. So just a little update. Life throws you curveballs, and you just have to, roll with the punches is the phrase. Okay, let's get to tonight's topic. Oh, we have another person to admit. Yeah, now we're just starting, so you didn't miss anything. On your syllabus, you'll notice that we segue just kind of seamlessly from Chinese art that we covered. Of course, it's very important. At least one of those slides will be on, that we covered on Monday, will be on the final. And probably, but I can't say 100% for sure, probably one of the slides from Japanese art, because it's so influential. Some of you already know this if you studied graphic arts, or you've done your own maybe, or you just watch, what are they? I don't know what they're called. My daughter would know. A Japanese themed, program, social media, whatever, advertising, pop groups, right? K-pop is influenced too by Japanese art. They were occupied by Japan. Maybe you know that for a century, before World War II. So there's a strong influence of Japanese art and culture in Korea too. Okay, so let's talk about real quick what the context is. Very brief today. Japan has a population of about 130 million. It's dropping, actually. There's such a low birth rate there that they're actually losing population every year, which will eventually happen to most developed democracies, according to demographers. But at the moment, that's happening in Japan. So the population is aging, but they still have a very youth-oriented culture. You know this if you've studied their pop culture exports. And it comes, believe it or not, from their roots, from the past period, at least the themes and the stylistic techniques, is not so much as motifs, there we go, that you find in often modern Japanese graphic art of all kinds, from, cartoons, right? I don't know if anybody calls them cartoons anymore, right? And, or of course, artwork of all kinds, and even the fashion of some of the people's, the way they dress in some of the pop groups. So we're going to see how those influences got started today. Japan has the land area almost very close to the same size as California. We have 40 million people. Again, without being a math whiz, you can do the math. 40 million is less than a third of 130 million. So even if you round off, the country is more than three times as crowded as California, as crowded as we think our state is. It's much more crowded in Japan. Anybody here been to Japan? It's one of the few countries I've always found interesting and I haven't yet gotten to. Anybody been to Japan? Yep. Okay. Yes? Mm-hmm. Oh, you have? What part?
Tokyo, several times for business.
Oh, did you ever see Lost in Translation with Bill Murray? And anybody know what I'm talking about? A movie filmed in Tokyo, entirely in Tokyo. Yeah. Did you find it overwhelming in terms of the population? That's how I felt when I was in Hong Kong and Guangzhou and some other Asian cities. I've been to several Asian countries, but not Japan. So when you were there, did you walk around and, or did you just have meetings in, offices and things?
Oh, no, of course, walked around. Just briefly, I'll say in some places, it's more crowded than you can ever imagine. It makes New York feel like a teeny city. But I'll say in other areas, the Japanese are so styled and planned and controlled that you don't notice all the people because everything is just organized and designed so efficiently. It's hard to explain.
Mm-hmm. No, I think I know what you mean. From friends of mine, I have friends who do business there and who even live there. Yeah. Anyway, it's a source of some really great influences. And if we had time, I'd show you the influence of Japanese architecture, but that doesn't quite segue. Indirectly, it will with one of the slides that we're going to see. Okay, so let's do the screen share now. And let's hide this. Yeah, see, the Japanese are known for their simplicity of design in architecture. And I can just tell you this, you don't have to know this for the exam. Well, indirectly, I'll probably mention it when we get to the one architecture slide. Well, we actually have two, but the one that's more influential site than the others. And that's on the syllabus. We'll get to it before we finish today. Let's do the full view here. There we go. For the first must know. And if you don't know anything about Frank Lloyd Wright or Bernard Maybach or Julia Morgan or all the great architects of the 20th century, they were all inspired by Japanese architecture. Okay, but let's now talk about this first must know. It's at the bottom of the week 8, that page of week 8 lists. Flowers of beauty in the floating world. Flowers of beauty in the floating world is the title. Japan, of course, the location. The date is 1769. And speaking of Tokyo, when this was, which this is a line drawing, of course, with some, colorizing of the main figures, but it's, the background's black and white, as you can see. So what we have here is a traditional Japanese line drawing, or the type of drawing that they've become famous for, when it had already been a stylistic feature of Japanese art. And so let's define what marks this as specifically a classic example of Japanese style drawing. Okay, that's the first fact. That's what this is. There's no question now what's going on here. Very controversial, but we'll get to that. And that will be the one definition you'll have will relate to this image. But first, what makes this a classic example of Japanese line drawing, which is hundreds of years old? It predates this period. Well, first, the oblique angle. That is a very powerful image that Western artists never thought to do. Well, that's not entirely true. I misspoke. Some Western artists were doing it in the late Renaissance. That's true, but very, very, very few. Da Vinci didn't do it. Michelangelo didn't do it. Maybe you remember the other painting of The Last Supper by Tintoretto. He did do an oblique angle in that. He couldn't have seen Japanese art that far back. So there were a few Western artists, but it wasn't a trend. It became the rage, as the phrase used to go, all the rage, they used to say, when something caught on and overtook a medium of art. Japanese printmaking in general, and the oblique angle that each of the Japanese prints almost always, with rare exceptions, used. You see it here. I mean, there's no other word for it, oblique angle. It's very sharp and very different than Western art, which is usually straight, dead on, or maybe above, from an elevated position, looking down on something. This is a classic Japanese technique, the oblique angle of the entire room they're sitting. These two women, well, there's a young girl and an older woman. I'll talk about what they're doing in a few minutes. Okay, that's the first thing. The next is the bold outline around the main figures with geometric patterns worked into, well, the clothing. I mean, what else would it be? It wouldn't be their skin, right? Unless it's showing someone who's heavily tattooed, which they did do, but usually it's on their clothing. And so you see that here very clearly on the robes of the younger, protege of this woman, who, by the way, is a courtesan. I must tell you that, but there's more to it than the fact that she's a prostitute. I'll explain how that ties in with Japanese cultural traditions in a couple minutes. Okay, so the second feature, again, is bold outlines of Japanese printmaking around the main objects, particularly the human figures. But you even see it here on the window seat, right? And I guess you could say the framing of the windows. Okay, and then the third thing would be the use, I already kind of combined them, but really it's three different things, of the geometric patterns or decorative patterns on the main, usually on or around, sometimes both, the main figures. Here it's on the clothing of the two human figures. You don't really see it too much. Now that's not decorative patterning. This is Japanese, of course, wording, and it's describing the scene. That isn't essential to Japanese printmaking. It's rarely do you see that. You'll see what I mean when we see several more Japanese prints as we go along today. So that's optional. But the other three things, those are classic elements of all traditional Japanese print uh, art. Okay, but what's happening in this scene is ukiyo, an example of ukiyo, and that's a very important definition. Could easily come up on the true false section, or in the slide essay part of the final. And that's, of course, on your handout of terms to know, but I'll spell it. It's YUKIO hyphen capital E. That's how I've always seen it spelled when it's translated into English, of course. The phrase is Japanese. YUKIO hyphen E. So what is that? It's a term from Japanese art that means images of, it's a long definition. There's no way to shorten it. It's a term from Japanese art that means images from the floating world, comma, which demonstrate the transitory nature of life, and emphasize enjoying the pleasures of life while we can, or life's pleasures, and emphasize enjoying life's pleasures while we can, period. In a way, you could say it's spiritual, and another you could say it's totally anti-spiritual, right? I mean, if you think about it, right? I mean, it's kind of a philosophy, a way to live life, which is enjoy today. You never know what'll come tomorrow, right? I mean, that's not that new. I mean, it's been around from almost the beginning of human culture, but in Japan, they raised it to a higher level by incorporating themes in their art that spoke to the need to enjoy the pleasures of this world, of this life while we can. So that's what these images are symbolic of. You're going to see a couple of those ukiyo images. This is a prostitute with a young protege. The controversy to us today is obvious. Having a daughter, I definitely would find this objectionable, except for the fact that it's 250-year-old image from a culture which did not see it as controversial. Prostitutes were not looked down on in Japan, at least not at this point in their history. And young proteges, I mean, I hate to say, probably could even be this woman's daughter. In any case, she's certainly a young, probably school-age child, will almost certainly end up with that same line of work. And that was not considered controversial because it's part of that philosophy of ukiyo, that we enjoy what? Pleasures of the flesh, pleasures of the intellect. When I say the mind, that might sound esoteric. We're talking about plays, literature, food. So live performances of all kinds, music, food, and yes, carnal pleasures were all incorporated into that philosophy of ukiyo. And you do see the evidence of that in their artwork for hundreds of years. Now, the last part of the meeting is, where are they? They're in Tokyo. They're on the harbor of Tokyo. When this was made, this piece, Tokyo was, there's a debate. I would dispute a little bit Stockstead on this. Supposedly the only city with 1 million people. Well, London had 1 million people by the late 1700s. It definitely did. So it's one of 2 cities on Earth that had 1 million people. Remember, that hadn't happened if you took ancient art or ancient history since Rome. Rome was the first city on Earth to ever have 1 million, reached 2 million before it fell. Ancient Rome, we're talking about, of course, today it's much bigger. So what we have, I'll say it again, is a view on the outskirts of Tokyo, the harbor, a view of the harbor of Tokyo. And at the time it was made, Tokyo wasn't even called Tokyo, it was called Edo, E-D-O. That was the name of Tokyo before it was changed to the current name. And it was one of only 2 cities on Earth to have 1 million people. Sorry, go ahead, please, go ahead.
What was the name?
Edo, capital E-D-O.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's an odd word. If you don't remember that, it's okay, as long as you get the location. If it's on the essay part. They are looking out over the harbor of Tokyo, which was already one of the 2 largest cities on Earth, and one of only 2 that had 1 million people. Okay, plenty on the meaning, formal analysis. It's well balanced, isn't it? With the 2 human figures in the middle. And, this forms kind of a nice oval shape, the poses. It's clearly meant to be balanced. And then you've got the window seat with the shade. That's probably a shade right on the window. It's supposed to symbolize, or the top. You can see top decorative pattern, and so it's roughly balanced. I would say both left to right and top to bottom. And then we have the largest mass, pretty easy. Well, maybe not. Maybe it's a window seat, but then it would be the adult courtesan. They would have used that word, or prostitute. And then after that, it would be the young one here. And then I guess the boat, the largest boat in the harbor. In terms of stable versus dynamic, it's both. It's stable on the window framing. And both figures, I mean, she forms a right angle, her body, the adult woman. And the child, the young woman standing up, little girl, I guess you'd say she's almost entirely stable. Now, their heads, of course, and hairdos are not. And some of the bottoms of their two robes, those are dynamic. You could say the whole thing has a dynamic feeling because of the oblique angle, especially noticeable on the windowsill. But there are clearly stable elements, and stable really is the word I'd use. It's about equal for the two human figures, their poses, at least, their bodies. I already said there's bold outline. You see bold outline just about everywhere here. And then there's some thin outline on the boats in the harbor. There is little to no modeling. I only see it on their hair, really, in these, and that's also classic Japanese. But actually, some people would say on the bottom of the window seat. I guess you could call that modeling. Yeah, you could. So there is some modeling, but it's minimal. It's limited. Simulated textures are well done on the hair, on the clothing, on this plant, the water in the harbor. And I even sense this rough texture of wood, on a window. Of course, it would be made out of wood, a window seat. And it is full of the rhythm of the waves on the water, the window framing, the two human bodies, arms, hands, legs, plenty of rhythm. Colors, warm mostly on the clothing of the two women, cool on their skin tones. They would have used white pancake makeup if they were, dressing as a traditional courtesan style dress would have been then. And then there's somewhat of a pinkish cast, isn't there, to the underlying color of the paper. It's made on paper. So you could say the background has a feeling, and even the sky, somewhat of a tan color. And the far edges of the water where there's no waves, somewhat of a light pink, or therefore warm tone. So overall, it's mostly warm. The cool tones, of course, are on the plant here and some of their clothing. And let's see, balance, rhythm. Oh, for space, you've got overlapping. This doesn't have foreshortening, though. Look, it gets wider as it goes further away from us. That's completely contradictory to that technique. So it does not have atmospheric perspective or scientific perspective. It just has diminishing size and overlapping. Okay, let's move on. This is the next must know, and it's therefore at the top of the next page. Turn to it. This is Himeji Castle, Himeji Castle. And the location is Osaka, a city in Japan. I think it's the second largest city. I think that's right. It's one of the largest cities in Japan. Osaka, Osaka. We give you the location because there are only a few castles left in Japan, authentic, historic, original castles from the warlord era. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So this is the most famous one. The largest, I believe it is, of all the surviving authentic castles from several hundred years ago. You can't say medieval because 1600s is not the Middle Ages. 1609 is the year. Well, let's start with the fact that this is a survivor of the warlord era. The other phrase for it is the shogun era. S-H-O-J-U-N. I think you don't have to worry about the spelling of that, but there's more than one way to spell some foreign words, and that's one of them. But shogun, you spell it phonetically, is a Japanese word, translated in English, of course, for the warlord class. We're talking about those who hired armies, had, paid mercenary armies to fight each other and try to gain control over their rivals. Territory, wealth, right, and population. Of course, they were trying to control the populations, the land or territory, and the wealth of rival warlords. So it's called either the warlord era or the shogun era, and it lasted for hundreds of years. So during the height of that would be about the time this was built, the height of the shogun or warlord area. The castles were, of course, one might imagine, the headquarters of some of the more powerful warlords. the more powerful they were, the larger, and you can say fancier if you want to. And this one is definitely fancy. The larger and fancier the castles were for the more powerful, wealthier warlords. So this one somehow survived because most of them were either destroyed during fighting or torn down for development, high rises and what have you. This one has survived on a hill above the main town of Osaka. It's really quite fascinating because it was impregnable, apparently. Well, actually, I know it was never taken by enemy attack. And there's several reasons. First of all, there's a very narrow, winding path that leads up to the front entrance. So soldiers shooting from above from these windows, right, on this 6 stories, it's 6 stories, 6 level or 6-story tall castle, could easily pick off many, if not all, of the attempted attacking forces, right, of the soldiers trying to come up that hill. Plus, it's very steep. Here it's not, but it would have been to get up to that level. Then we have the fact that the ground level is rough stone, which is very, if not impregnable, right, it's at least resistant to any kind of weapons or even including fire, right? So that's part of why it survived. Although it's missing here, so I don't know if they replaced the stone in this section. Because now it's a tourist site, by the way. Today it's open to the public. It's an historic site. Okay, run by, I'm sure, the city of Osaka. And then we have the pagoda-like roof lines. Remember, I defined pagoda, and that's a definition you want to make sure you have from the last lecture. If you weren't there to hear it, you want to make notes on that definition when you watch the YouTube video of Monday's lecture. These wide overhanging eaves supported by brackets are classic features of pagodas. Pagodas, I used to think it was only religious structures. Well, there's nothing religious about this, but this is a pagoda style section, but not the whole thing is, because you've got multiple wings and sections. So the whole thing combined together forms a defensive, outpost or headquarters for a warlord. So the word castle is the proper word. And then we have the other reasons why it was not ever taken, and that's how defenders could, from these high spots here, pour boiling oil or anything like that down on attackers down below, or of course just shoot arrows at them or throw flaming, say that fast 5 times, throw flaming objects down on the heads of the attackers. So this was so well defended that it was never taken by any enemy army or any attackers. Okay, that's pretty much the whole meaning. All right, formal analysis. I would call, if you stood here, I've seen videos of this actually. I've studied many Japanese architectural sites because it's such an influential culture in world architecture. So if you stood here and looked at this, it would be symmetrical left to right. There's another wing just like this. You can't see beyond the edge. So it's symmetrical left to right and unbalanced or balanced right that way, and unbalanced toward the bottom because, of course, it's wider at the bottom. For space, it's a 6 stories high, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-story or 6-level structure that reaches a height of about 100 feet. You can say nearly or about 100 feet. And then there are dozens of rooms inside, larger and smaller rooms. You don't have to describe the interior space, of course, because I don't know what those rooms are like, but multiple rooms that are used for the defenders to live in and defend this castle. The rhythm is very, very powerful here with the overhanging eaves, the windows, right? And even the finials. I did tell you that word might come up. I think I did. Yeah, I know I did. Finials, right? I mean, every culture seems to like finials, right? I mean, you still see them on tops of skyscrapers that are over 1,000 feet tall all around the world today, right? Spires, some people call them, but if it's the tall, very tall and narrow, then you could call that a spire. But these are not meant to be particularly prominent. They're just decorative. I think they're fish patterns. In any case, there's some kind of creature or animal pattern as a decorative detail at the top or edge of the roof. And so those are finials. They're all over. They create powerful rhythms. Color is definitely cool with the blue glazed or clay tile and the whitewashed stucco walls. The only thing warm is the stone work below. And the textures are real rough stone, real smooth glass, and real smooth tile, and real smooth plaster. So again, 3 real smooth textures: glass, plaster, and tile work, and then one real rough texture, the stonework. There's no technique for modeling. It's just the shadows created by the sun. Here, the lines are visual. You can't really see any carved or drawn lines. Maybe if you got up close, you might be able to see some here, but in this view from a distance, you can't. So you can just say the lines are only visual lines, drawn or painted line. And I would describe it as both stable and dynamic. The largest mass is the ground level, right? The first two levels, but then it tapers off after you see that on the third level. It recedes inward, of course. So each level smaller from the third level to the sixth. But the bottom two levels, if you break it down that way, are therefore the largest mass. And then the middle two, third level, and then the top part gets smaller as you go up. And then finally, we have the rhythm. Oh, no, stable, I meant to say. The walls, of course, the corners of each section are stable, but the roof lines are dynamic. And even this foundation, look, see how that tilts outward? That will help discourage people from climbing up outside of the walls to attack the inhabitants. So the corners of the stone walls are dynamic, but the walls of the stucco part of the building are stable.
What did you say on the color? What did you say about blue?
Cool, yeah, blue is always cool. Right? See, that's blue tile. Japanese don't like red tile much, at least from what I said. Well, maybe someone wants to correct me, the person who went to Tokyo.
Oh, so the roof tile.
Traditional tile in Japan, at least all the studies I've seen of it, they prefer the blue color, as many other Asian cultures do. But red clay tiles are common in China, so it's not just a thing about Asia. Yeah, blue is a cool color, obviously. So is white. So the whole upper 5 levels are cool. And then the only thing warm is the foundation level with the warm stone. Okay, here we go. Here's the next architecture one. And on this one, I am going to draw a connecting dot or line between modern meaning in the last 130 years. Okay, that's considered modern. Anything from the late 1800s to today is, quote, early or late modern architecture in America, directly inspired by this style of building from Japan. So this is, here we go, the next must-know slide. Hang on. I have to spell it for you. It's Fusuma, one word. The room itself, the building it's in, I think is named Fusuma, F-U-S-U-M-A, Fusuma. The architect's name, you don't have a location here because instead we know the architect, so you need to know his name if it's on the final. Itiko or Itiko, heard that pronounced both ways. Capital E-I-T-O-K-U, 1573. Okay, so who was Itiko? We don't need to know much about him because what's important is the style of the building, but we can say one thing. He was one of the most successful and famous, there we go, successful and famous of Japanese architects to use, who used, you could say, the traditional Japanese tea house as inspiration for their work. That's what this room is patterned after. It's one room in a series designed all by the same architect, Itiko, that I just told you. And it was one of the early, not the first, but one of the earlier examples of the influence of traditional Japanese tea house architecture in other buildings. Well, this is not a tea house, is just one building on the grounds of a wealthy person, usually, where they conducted a tea ceremony. And that's it. It sits usually off in the edge of a garden or something by itself. There are examples of that in the Japanese, it is. I said it right. The Japanese tea garden, you can go and get extra credit by taking pictures. Remember, 4 photos of exteriors in Golden Gate Park, right next to the Diag Museum, the Japanese tea garden. You'll see similar influences. But I don't remember if they let you go in those buildings, even before the pandemic. I don't think they do. But this is not just one room. This is the room we're going to concentrate on and describe, the stylistic features and the formal elements. But I just be clear that the context is it's part of a larger set of rooms in a home built for, of course, it would have to be a wealthy client by the architect. So he, again, was one of the first architects and the most famous and successful of the early Japanese architects to be inspired or use the elements of a Japanese tea house design. What are those? So here we go. First, simplicity of line and surfaces. Now, you might say, wait a minute, that's pretty ornate. That is the choice of the client. The client wanted landscape paintings on Shoji screens. Now, I should have included that, but I didn't in the list of terms to know, but I'll spell that for you. Shoji, S-H-O-J-I, is a Japanese word that implies rice paper screens dividing rooms, which may or may not be plain or decorated. So you won't have to know that definition. It won't come up on the true false section of the final. But if this slide's on the final, that's relevant to the meaning of this slide. So we see here they're decorated. These are paintings done right on these Shoji, again, that's S-H-O-J-I screens. And usually, though, in American influence, buildings, I mean, Japanese influence, sorry, American architecture, the walls that use these, they're room dividers. You can move them back and forth. You can open them. Here they open, I'm sure, inward and outward, but sometimes they slide back and forth into the walls. But here they open, outward and inward. So those are room dividers that can be, partially left open, all of them open at the same time, all of them closed. It's a very simple and elegant way to divide different spaces, interior spaces. And usually in this country, they didn't decorate them. Maybach used them a lot, Bernard Maybach. If you don't know about his work and you get to Berkeley, another easy 10 points, and it's free, is to get a guided tour at noon every day of the year. The Christian Science Church in Berkeley, right above the Old People's Park, which they're going to build a 15-story skyscraper on, but they haven't started yet for student housing. In Berkeley, it's a national historic landmark. It's called the First Church of Christ Scientists. We shorten it to First Christian Science Church by Maybach. It's a masterpiece. I chose it for the cover of my book on him. He's the one that started green design in this country. He was very obviously inspired by Japanese architecture, and he uses Shoji screens inside several spaces within that church, not the worship hall, but the other rooms, for the meetings and the library and the offices. And it's so beautiful because it's a very light pastel color, undecorated rice paper type of effect. So that's actual rice paper. It didn't always have to be. It could be some other kind of very translucent paper that allows natural light to penetrate. So simplicity of line and material is a classic Japanese tea house technique. Another is undisguised natural materials. These materials are not like a Victorian wood or even a Renaissance era buildings in Europe, where they disguise the wood to look, either carved it or put gargoyles on it. You know what I'm talking about. You've seen plenty of examples of those. And not just in Hollywood, Halloween movies, Hollywood Halloween, dare say that fast. Hollywood Halloween movies where, the houses are haunted. And so, of course, every room has some kind of, carved decoration on the woodwork or whatever. No, not in Japan, you wouldn't. Not at least in a classic or traditional style tea house inspired interior. So all of these are functional here. This is the actual framing of the walls. And of course, that's the roof or the ceiling, and above it, the roof. And then this here helps divide the rooms because you can hang from these beams. Again, these would be temporary curtains and things. So then you also have the final thing is the use of natural light. Open flowing floor plans. Actually, the easiest way is maybe to write it like Frank Lloyd Wright used to say, free flowing floor plans. He did that all the time in his early houses, his early modern houses, all the way back to the 1890s. He lived in Japan for a couple of years, by the way. He was very inspired by their traditional architecture. So the third feature, again, to finish up on the meaning of this slide, that marks it as a classic example of Japanese tea house inspired design, is a free flowing floor plan, which that by definition means it's more open and light. It would, by natural light flooding into this space and not having walls subdividing every little part of it into smaller rooms. So an open, or you can say it either open or free flowing floor plan is another feature the Japanese invented, pretty much developed first, and then it was inspired. It was an inspiration, I meant to say, for architects all over the world. not just in the United States, but very heavily so in this country, and then also parts of Europe and other Asian countries. So it's just the kind of simplicity that wasn't common in European and American architecture at the time this was built. This was the Renaissance, and things were ornamental. We covered Baroque, right? I mean, the early Baroque was around the same time. So this is not, except maybe some think the paintings on the walls, but that's just an individual choice of the client that he chose to decorate the Shoji screens. All right, that's plenty on the meaning. Formal analysis. Oh, what was the room used for? It was used for various ceremonies, greeting guests, visitors, a tea ceremony itself. Yes, the actual formal Japanese tea ceremony, other actual meals like dinners and things. And even for meditation by the family that lived there, prayer and meditation. So it's used for all kinds of gatherings of either just the family that lives there or visitors and guests at different times of the day for different ceremonies or functions, meals, tea ceremony, prayer, or just conversation with your visitor. Okay, formal analysis. The colors are warm, obviously, on the wood and the Shoji screens, because that's kind of a tannish color. And then cool on the upper walls. That's plaster, by the way, painted white. The rhythm is powerful. Of course, it is on the screens, you could say, because of the painting. And since it's part of the slide, that's definitely part of what you could say about it. Where is the rhythm? It's both on the screens and on the walls. There's the frameworks. And the ceiling, even though you can't see a lot of it, you can see through these louvers here. The shapes are repeated, simple rectangular shapes everywhere you look. The textures are all real textures except for the paintings themselves, but the actual Shoji screens have the smooth, translucent texture of a rice paper panels, right? The floor is the real smooth texture of polished wood. That's wood, polished, highly polished. And then there's the real rough texture of the wood framing, including on the ceiling and the walls. So the only submitted textures could be considered some of the painting. As far as line goes, again, the painting has fold lines, of course, the landscape details, but the building proper doesn't. So you could just concentrate on that. It's all visual lines, right? Formed by the framing. There's no carve. There's a little bit of carved line here. You could make, but that's so minor you don't really have to write about it. You can just say all the lines on the structure itself, this room, the actual architecture, are visual. There's no carved or painted lines on the walls. For space, it's a single rectangular room with about a 15-foot high ceiling. That's it. It's real space. It is stable. There's nothing dynamic about this. Japanese architecture tends to almost always be stable, except on the exterior where the roofs overhang, with the pagoda-style roof line. Tea houses often did that on the roof line, but it's not visible here. So everything you can see here is stable. Again, except some of the details on the painting on the walls. Balance, totally symmetrical, completely symmetrical. I would say no matter how you divide it, top to bottom, right? You do the line roughly here, it's equal above and below. And of course, it's rectangular, so it's balanced left to right. It's really one mass. I don't think you can break it down unless you want to. And then I suppose you could say each Shoji screen is the smallest mass. If you count this as one mass, it's up to you. Right then, I suppose it's the second largest mass. And that would mean that the floor and the ceiling are the two largest because they're the same size, of course, by definition. Okay, textures, I think I covered that right. And the colors are warm. I think that's everything, right? Rhythm, balance. Okay. This one, let's see. We're still going to end on time, I'm sure. Lacquer box, just like it sounds. Lacquer, as you probably know, but I'll spell that as Lacquer box. The artist's name, we have his name, so you wouldn't use Japan. If it's on the exam, you'd write Korin, Korin. And this would be 1700. So we are seeing here a classic, or you would say traditional aspect of Japanese decorative art. Painted lacquer boxes are something common all over the Eastern Hemisphere, not just Japan, but they raised it to a high level or high art during the last several hundred years in Japan. The only other country that has that tradition and even more ornate is Russia. If some of you know this, if you've seen some of the gift shops in San Francisco run by Russian immigrants, or even just movies, with CIA agents trying to hide things in lacquer boxes they buy on the streets of Moscow. I bought a bunch of souvenirs from when my daughter and my wife and I were waiting for her visa to bring her home from Russia. And while lacquer boxes are not, in other words, just a Japanese idea or even a Japanese invention, but they did take the decorative traditions of designing exterior patterns and motifs to an even higher level than probably any other culture at that time. So this is what, over 300 years ago. So here we have a kind of a close-up of a landscape, but this is mother of pearl. And then this is lead. So the lead is part of the decorative pattern, or is it reinforcing the wood itself? It's hard to say, because I don't remember seeing that described in Stockstead, but the lead is part of the current design. So it probably was original. It looks like, because there's a crack here, that this lead might have been used, perhaps at the other corners we can't see, to reinforce it. I would think that's more likely, because that lead overlaps the painted patterns here of the underbrush. I don't know what else you want to call it, the brush that you'd see along the edge of a pond or some kind of lagoon. But then these are flowers, and they're beautifully done, inlaid mother of pearl flowers. So you have this pattern. Remember, I said the first slide with the images of the floating world, right? Or beauty, I should say, right, in the floating world. Flowers of beauty in the floating world. The first slide we saw today. That is part of the tradition of Japanese printmaking. Well, it also is to use decorative patterns, geometric repeated shapes. In a print, it's going to be on, probably the clothing of the main figures and then maybe the background. But on lacquer box, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's on, the flowers on the top and the side, and the, patterns of light and dark, contrasting light and dark, showing, background behind the plants. I don't know what else you call them. You could say they're weeds, but they're probably a little more rarefied than that. And then, of course, you could say that the lead patterns or panels, some said panels form a pattern, but again, I'm not sure they're original to the piece. They probably are partly. Maybe this piece is one that was added. It's hard to say. But in any case, you got plenty of patterns. And decorative patterns, of course, create rhythm. So let's do the formal analysis. Now, it's warm on the plants and neutral black, of course, on the background, and cool gray on the lead bracing, I guess you call it, and definitely cool color on the mother of pearl, off-white and gray. The rhythms are, again, very powerful with the plant patterns, the flowers, and the lead strips of lead. And then we have balance. I'd say roughly, you look at it left to right, if you're just looking at this side of it, which is one way to analyze. But if you look at the top, you could make the case it's weighted or unbalanced toward the bottom, because there are many more flowers below the middle line here than above. And on the side, in other words, you don't have to do a three-way. And if it's on the final, it's saying it won't be cut, but in case it is, you could just choose which side you want to analyze for balance. And then it's dynamic. Well, yeah, the box itself is stable, of course, mostly rectangular, slightly curved corners, but even the lead patterns here, although they, in a way, they're stable, they form a curved line at the corners, and then these do definitely dynamic. And all of the decorative patterns, the flowers and the plants, have diagonal or curved lines. So those are all dynamic. And then we have textures. It's real smooth texture of lacquer, which is paint over wood, right? This is a wooden box, if it's not obvious. But you don't see the wood, so you wouldn't need to describe that texture. You would just say that there's cement texture on the flowers and none on the plants. I don't see any cement texture here. And there's no modeling either. Some people might say that it appears to be a little bit on the inlay. I could certainly see that. So on some of the mother of pearl flowers, not so much on the bottom here or the top, but in a couple of them around this part of the lid there are. So there's some limited modeling, but mostly it doesn't have modeling. And there really isn't line as outline here. Not as outline, except because of the inlay, there's the difference between the edges of the mother of pearl and the wood it's inlaid into. So that forms visual line only on the inlay parts, I would say. But no drawn or painted line. And let's see, colors already mentioned. Space. Oh, this is a real three-dimensional object, and it's about 10 inches long. You say a little less than a foot long, and it probably is something close to that. 8 to 10 inches tall or deep, and it's empty. It's totally hollow inside. It's meant, of course, to contain valuables. So, see, did we cover everything? Rhythm, balance? No, there's only one mass, the optic itself. I wouldn't say that. If you want to break it down, you could say the flowers are the smallest mass, then the plants, and then the lid strips. Okay, I'm cutting. Actually, we didn't. I forgot to cut one. I always try to do that. This one, it's too small. I couldn't get it large enough. And plus, which, I want to give you guys a break whenever I can. So take your pens out if you didn't already do this. And you see where it says landscape at the top of the page that you should be on now for the remaining. We have 2 more slides. Landscape, cross that out. Bonsai. I couldn't get a useful image of it, so you don't have to even worry about that. There are 2 more though, and of those 2, one of them is very highly likely to be on the final, and that's this. If you don't know this work, I guess you've never seen Japanese art. It's probably the most famous image in the history of Japanese art. But we have 2 more. This one is second to last. It's also important. Otani Oniji acting. That's the name of the actor that is portrayed. The portrait is of him. Capital O-T-A-N-I. His last name is capital O-N-I-J-I. Otani Oniji acting, as in the process of acting. 3 words is the title. We have the artist's name, so you need to have that spelled correctly. S-H-A-R-A-K-U. Sharaku, 1794. This is another example of ukiyo influence in Japanese art. And this is the Japanese print. And so it has much of the same aspects of the first slide we saw today. But remember what ukiyo is. So if this is on I apologize for not saying the first slide is so important. I'm not cutting it from the study list. The very first slide, the one of the beauty, right? Flowers of beauty in the floating world. I won't cut that one for sure from the study list. The next several, I may or may not cut some of them. We'll do that. Remember, the week before finals, we'll reduce the list by at least 40%. But this is one I also won't cut because it's a great example of the ukiyo tradition in Japanese print art. This man was one of the most famous and popular actors in all of Japan during his career. And he would entertain people, and it's part of the pleasures of this world or of this life that we should enjoy while we're here. Remember that definition of ukiyo. That is very likely to come up on the final in some way. We all live in a transitory, right? The world we live in is transitory, the nature of it by definition. And so we should enjoy the pleasures of this life while we can. One of them was theater, Japanese theater. When I was a kid, my mother took me to kabuki theater. I don't know if anybody's been to that. It's a very stylized type of theater. And when I was a little kid, I didn't understand it that well, but I loved watching the costumes and hearing the music. There was a large Japanese population in Chicago, and my parents were friends with several couples who would invite us to come with them to see Japanese traditional theater from this period. So what is it? What's he doing here is part of the meaning. He's deliberately exaggerating every aspect of his performance, from his facial expressions. That should be obvious, but if it isn't, we'll get up close here. Right? He's crossing his eyes and he's squinching his mouth. So his facial features and his pose, see, even the way his hands with his fingers extended like that are depicted. And even the body language of his leaning over So his body forms kind of, not exactly, but we're looking at him from a diagonal angle. That's again the definition, remember, of an oblique angle. So Japanese prints almost always did that. And this does that too. It has an oblique angle. But his body is also, the pose I'm talking about is in and of itself, his pose has a very exaggerated aspect. It's like he's leaning over, you know, a rival or an enemy or somebody he's trying to sneak up on. So he's exaggerated the emotions by expressing in all the traditional Japanese theater. That's what was expected. You know, we're talking about people who didn't have the front 2 or 3 row seats. They're sitting in the back of a theater with hundreds of seats usually. So of course, it would be hard for them to know what emotions there were except for the dialogue. And some scenes, of course, there isn't dialogue in the entire, right, the whole scene. So that's how they conveyed their emotions in Japanese traditional theater. And he was a master of that. Exaggerated elements such as the extreme expressions on their faces, their body language, and their poses. And again, the underlying meaning is that this is a classic example of the ukiyo philosophy as it was relayed through theater performances, which were one of the pleasures of this world that people were, you know, let's say exhorted or advised to enjoy while you can, you know, still go out and see theater while you're still healthy enough to do that. Okay, so formal analysis. Well, it's unbalanced toward the bottom, clearly, but I would say it's roughly balanced left to right. Just depends on where you draw the line, I would say so. It's really a single mass, so I wouldn't break it down into larger and smaller masses. For space, the only technique is overlapping. I don't see foreshortening here. Maybe some of you might, but I don't really see that on his shoulder and his neck. And Japanese traditional prints didn't usually apply that technique until much later. The texture is excellent, though, isn't it? On his hair, his eyebrows, and to some extent on the clothing. It's less so on his, you know, the rest of his face, his neck and hands. The rhythm is obvious with the eyebrows, the eyes themselves, of course, the patterns in his hair, and the decorative features. Oh yeah, the decorative patterns that mark something as, again, part of Japanese traditional print style are obvious on his clothing. They of course therefore create very strong rhythms, as do his hands with his extended fingers and all the features on his face. There isn't really much modeling here. I mean, maybe you could say it's on his hair, maybe, but I wouldn't really say that's modeling it, except possibly around the edges of his head. It almost looks like he's applied a hairpiece on top of his own hair, and he may well have done for the effect, for, you know, visual effect during his performance. So at most, there's a little bit of modeling at the top of his head, but otherwise there's none. Lines, though, bold. Again, the bold outlines do tend to speak towards, at least where you can see them, around his mouth and his eyes, his eyebrows. Maybe thin on the hands, I guess you could say, yeah, but on his face, they're mostly bold. So not all lines in Japanese traditional print art have to be bold, but at least many of them are. So there's both thin and bold outline. And then we have dynamic versus stable. I don't see anything stable about it. Maybe you could say the overall upward, you know, angle of his head, the way he's holding his head. But once you start looking at the details, you know, the hair, the ears, the nose, the chin, and all of his body, the clothing, the angles of his hands, it's mostly dynamic. For space, you just have overlapping. That's it. I think we covered it. There's no real diminishing size, and definitely not any other technique. And then let's see, color. It's warm on most of his clothing, and he would have used the white pancake makeup, as did the courtesans too, and many other performing and/or public figures would in public, especially in the theater. So that would be a kind of a light off-white, or therefore cool color. His hair, obviously, and part of his clothing is neutral. And the rest of his robes, well, this is cool. Of course, it's green, but most of the rest of the robes are warm. Okay, let's do our last must know. I think I covered everything, right? Balance, rhythm, texture, modeling. Yeah, okay. This is a really important slide. Of all the slides you're going to see today, it has the highest possibility of being on the final. It's so famous. I'm sure many, if not most or all of you have seen it before. The Great Wave. I don't need to spell those words, right? The Great Wave. The artist's name, last name is Hokusai. Hokusai. 1831. Hokusai was by far the most popular and famous, therefore the most influential. You could say all three: popular, famous, and influential of all Japanese print artists of his era. He lived well into his 80s, I believe it was. He had a long career, in other words, generations, decades, however you want to say it, for several decades or generations, he was the dominant Japanese print artist. His work was so popular that it was produced in volumes where prints collected together into a single bound volume would sell for a very high price, first in Japan and then overseas. His work began to influence the Impressionists, which would be probably after he died, because I don't think he lived into the 1870s when Impressionism took hold, and we'll cover that later, of course, in France. But definitely artists like Van Gogh. Van Gogh knew his work quite well, as did Monet and several other of the, Renoir. They would look at the oblique angle, which this clearly has, and the decorative features like this. Look at the wave. That's not natural. Of course, the waves don't have little fingers coming out, little hands or claws, but it's beautifully done. It gives you the feeling of the wave being alive, and that's what he's trying to convey. So the decorative patterns are here, and the bold lines are really obvious. So this is a classic example of Japanese print art, but he's the most famous of all. Not just during his lifetime, but since he passed away, I think that's fair to say. His work is still greatly influential even today. So he did several series of prints, and this is one from, I don't remember if it was 20, just say views of, doesn't matter how many, Tokyo and Mount Fujiyama. He did a series called Views of Tokyo. I misspoke. This is from a series, I'll say it again, called Views of Mount Fuji. They usually shorten that, F-U-J-I. Of course, the full name is Fujiyama. That's a volcanic mountain that's, I think it's the tallest in Japan. In any case, it's the most famous mountain in Japan. So again, this is from a series of prints, his most popular series that sold all over the world. First all over Japan, and then all over the US and Europe and the rest of the Middle East even. Yeah, people collected these all over the globe. A series again called Views of Mount Fuji. So Mount Fuji is not the main theme here, though, is it? Certainly not the most important object. It's the wave, the great wave that's about to crash over these two boats, already starting to swamp the boat closest to us, and then it's about to do the same to the boat further away. It's just brilliant. I mean, it gives almost a feeling of a spirit in the water. It's in, as in Native American religious beliefs in other parts of the world, many other religions, of course, have had those ideas or traditions for thousands of years, that souls or spirits or some kind of spiritual presence is not only in living things, let alone just human beings, but in all of, the earth, all objects, inanimate or living, have some kind of spirit presence. And he clearly is indicating that with the way he's depicted this way. Okay, formal analysis, and then, well, actually, there is one more thing about the meaning. Yeah, I was going to say that this, the fact that Mount Fuji is so small here does not mean that it is not the most important part of this. The title tells us the wave is what he wants to focus on, but Mount Fuji is a sacred, this is the last part of the meaning now, a sacred site to most people, Japan, at least everyone I've talked to who's lived there or is from there. Friends of my parents and so forth. At some point in your life, even if you're born here and you're Japanese American and you want to go back to Japan, you're going to want to see Mount Fuji because it's a spiritual place. It is I don't know if it's an extinct volcano, but it's a volcanic peak. You can just keep it simple. And it's always covered with snow. Of course, that could be changing with global warming, but the last I checked, it was snow capped. And he's emphasizing that aspect, even though it's in the distance here, right? It nonetheless is an important anchor or focal point of his series, of all of these prints, including this one, even though the wave dominates the foreground. Okay, formal analysis. Well, again, if you break it up into masses, you'd say the wave is the largest, then the closest boat, and then the further boat, and then fourth and last would be Mount Fuji. It's so dynamic. I don't think there's any straight lines in it. I don't see any anywhere on the waves, on the boats, even the people, because you see mostly just their head and shoulders, and not on Mount Fuji. Bold outline everywhere. I really don't see thin outline here. I mean, maybe on the heads of the men in the boat, maybe. But all the other objects in it have bold lines. There is modeling here, very nicely done. And that's a little different than most Japanese prints. The difference in the contrast of the foamy white top of the wave and the little bit of modeling on the fingers, if you want to call it, of the wave as it's about to crash. And then the deeper, darker modeling effect, the darker colors on the underside of the wave. It's very well done, very highly emphasized, of course. And then we have for space, we have overlapping and diminishing size. I don't think you could say foreshortening. I don't see it on the boat on this, and you definitely can't see it on the boat that just the edges of that boat in the distance. The rhythms are powerful, as they would be in all Japanese prints, but especially Hokusai's work on the little fingers. I mean, that's the only word I can think of to call the edges of the waves, both the larger and smaller wave. The boats themselves, the sailors, I guess they're sailors inside the boat. And, of course, the two sides of Mount Fuji form very, very strong rhythm. It's mostly cool, isn't it? The only thing's warm is the background of the sky behind Mount Fuji in the distance there. That's not atmospheric perspective. Don't confuse that. It's in fact, it's the opposite of that. So it is only overlapping and diminishing size that's used for space. Let's see, then we have texture. Oh, I think it's brilliant. I would say realistic texture. The water has a kind of slightly glassy look, but the foamy tops of the waves, they do sometimes take on a white appearance, depending on what moment in time you're capturing here. But I'd say there's also fairly realistic simulated textures on the wooden boats, on the woodwork of the two boats, and even on let's go take a closer look on the snow-capped peak of Mount Fuji in the distance. That appears to have, to me, very realistic simulated texture. In all the photos and films I've seen of this site in Japan, especially from a distance, that's about how it would look. So I think it's everywhere you see there's realistic simulated texture, and then maybe slightly unrealistic on the edges of the wave, the tops of especially the biggest wave, because of course you don't see that kind of pattern of finger-like protruding sections of a wave per se. So maybe that's not realistic simulated texture, but everything else is. The largest mass, if you can break it down, would be the Great Wave, and then the second largest wave, and then the closest boat, right? Did I cover that? I think I did, yeah. Okay, am I missing anything? Balance, oh yeah, that's kind of important. I would say it is unbalanced, clearly, technically speaking, without much dispute, to the left because of the wave. But then the feeling of the water here rising and these boats coming, in from above, from a higher level of the other waves, that obviously it's coming over the crest of an earlier wave. It almost feels balanced, but it isn't technically. You'd have to say, yeah, unbalanced toward the left. And therefore, if you count the sky is not actually having mass and there are no clouds, right, or anything else in the sky, you'd have to say, again, it's unbalanced toward the bottom. Okay, we've covered everything and slightly before 4:15. So now, any questions anybody has about anything we've covered here? Or about, now I'm grading the papers, and I didn't have a chance yesterday. There was too much going on. But Thursday and Friday, I should be able to get back all the papers that were returned to me by readers and that were graded on and turned in on time. If your paper was turned in late, it could take another week or so to get back to you. The grade, I'm talking about the grade. But I will try to get everyone's grade returned, let's say by the weekend, certainly if possible by late Friday. And of course, I will post both this and the previous lecture on YouTube you should be able to see them or access them by 8 p.m. on Friday. If you missed any of this, the first part of this, or any or all of the Monday lecture, you do want to do that. Watch, because one of the slides from the lecture on Monday will very likely be on the final. And this slide, if not any of the others, it's so important. I'm not cutting it. I've already said the first and last slides today will be ones I'm not cutting from the study list. Could also be very highly possibly on the final. Okay, any questions now about extra credit, about what we covered today, or about your papers or anything else? Anybody? Any questions?
I do have a question about the extra credit. The Asian Museum was closed, but I had chance to attend a lecture.
Yeah.
Does that count or
Oh,
not?
the Asian Museum, it's open. Last I was told it was open.
Yeah,
Aren't you the one that
yesterday-
sent me a
yesterday
photo?
was closed.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yesterday was closed, but I had the opportunity to attend a Zoom lecture.
Oh, well, didn't you send, are you the person who sent me an image of a ticket to be admitted to the museum? Because somebody did. I thought it was not you. No, because that's worth 10 points if you go into any museum.
Okay.
They're all open. I mean, not every day, every
Yeah,
museum
yesterday
closes.
was closed.
Yeah, you have to check before you don't want to go without checking. Sorry, I never said that because I just figured you check online.
No, I checked online, so that was how I knew that there's going to be a lecture. So I attend the lecture.
Yeah, that'll count. I'll count that. Remind me. Thank you for bringing it up. That's that lectures that have to do with art. I used to give them a lot, but now, of course, with the pandemic, it's not as practical as at all possible. Even maybe next semester, where if you attended, you'd get 15 points for coming to a lecture. But for a museum pre-recorded lecture, it's the same. You get for going to a museum, meaning you could do it up to 2 times for 10 points for each museum event. Right, that you could verify. Now I don't know how you're going to verify you were.
Yeah, I had a ticket and then I record some of the lectures.
Oh, okay, good.
Very interesting.
You could just send me
a
a brief. I don't need to see the whole thing, but if you can separate out some aspect, the beginning of it or something, an image or 2 or 3 images even from a video, and the date and the location, it'll mention which museum, the course in, and which class you're in, then you'd get 10 points for that. Yes, that's fine. Yeah. Okay, anybody else now? Any other questions? Now's a good time to ask us. This is my unofficial office hours. About anything, extra credit, I already mentioned the grades are coming, those who turned your papers on time in the next few days. Certainly, I would think by the end of this week that you should have your grades back. Or anything we covered today, any aspect of it, to Japanese art. Anybody? Nope. Anybody else? One more time. One last call.
Questions here.
Sure. Is that it? Okay. All right, you guys, you get off a little early. Yes, sorry, go ahead.
I sent you a direct message.
Yes.
On Zoom.
About?
Check it out. It's about the short paper.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll see it tomorrow because I'll be here I have a 3-hour lecture to set up for, and then I have an hour and a quarter minute drive home. So I don't check my email on Wednesdays, but I will tomorrow. And I'll get back to you and anyone else. So
okay.
Unless you want to ask the question now, and I can answer it verbally, unless I need to see your email to answer your question. Do you want to ask me now? Or it's up to you.
I just want to know. Well, since I turned in my short paper, but I guess it wasn't in the way you wanted it to be turned in, I resubmit it today.
Oh, okay.
I never received an email or grades.
Oh, I saw it though. I barely had time to glance at when my daughter told me she was sick and I needed to attend to her as a parent. I mean, I was just surprised. She didn't say when she got up in the morning that she wasn't going to be able to come today. But the point is that threw me off about 20 minutes from my schedule. So I didn't respond yet, but I can tell you, I think you're the one I saw the email from you, resubmission. Yeah. So I will then confirm with you tomorrow that I got it and I'll grade it by, I don't know. I may not get to that till the weekend, but before the next class, I should be able to.
I also want to ask if I'm going to get points knocked off, even though I turned it in the day it was due.
If you can show me evidence that it was submitted, but it does have to be submitted in the right format. So that's a gray area. It shows the timestamp of when you sent it and where.
Yeah.
If you send it to the right place, meaning Mark W at AOL, I'll just have to think about it. I might
Okay.
give you a pass on that because I don't want to be, extremely strict, but I also can't bend the rules too much for any one person. You see what I'm saying? So let me take a look at it. But if you had a timestamp on the original, if that isn't in the resending you're talking about, then you want to send me a separate email with evidence that you sent it in before the deadline. And then I
Okay,
can
sounds good.
consider not taking 5 points off.
Okay, thank you.
And yeah, okay, hopefully that'll work out. But I'll let you know that I got it and what happens with the grade over the next, say, 3 days or so. Okay, if not sooner. Okay, anybody else? Any other questions about grades, extra credit? All right. I will see you guys all next Monday. All right, take care. Have a good week. Bye.